The morning Genevieve Ashford swept into the Pine Hollow bank, she was already wearing her victory on her face. She didn't knock. She never knocked. She walked straight to the manager's desk, dropped a leather satchel onto his papers, and said, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear, "Execute the foreclosure on the Hollowbrook property. Today. Before the snow comes and they claim hardship." The teller at the counter went still. Two farmers waiting on a loan glanced at each other. The bank manager, a thin man named Gerald, who had worked for the Ashford family interests for 11 years, opened the satchel and looked at the papers without touching them. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "the family has a dying man in that cabin. The youngest child is barely 8 years old." Genevieve straightened her gloves, one finger at a time. Then they should have managed their debts better. She left without waiting for his answer. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're exactly who this was made for. Hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled. And subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because what happens after this foreclosure notice reaches Martha Hollowbrook's door will change everything you think you know about strength, worth, and what a man truly sees when he looks at a woman the whole town has already written off. Stay with me. This one goes all the way. Martha Hollowbrook found out about the foreclosure the same way she found out about everything that happened in Pine Hollow. Secondhand, too late, and from someone who clearly felt worse delivering the news than she felt receiving it. It was Ruth Calhoun, the postmaster's wife, who came up the hill on a Thursday afternoon with a covered dish and an expression she was trying very hard to keep neutral. Martha was splitting wood behind the cabin when she heard boots on the frostbitten path, and she straightened up with the axe still in her hand, one look at Ruth's face telling her this wasn't a social call. "Gerald sent a notice," Ruth said. She held out the envelope like it was something she wished she could put back. "I told Emmett it wasn't right, me bringing it, but the official courier didn't want to come up the hill, and I thought it'd be better coming from someone who—" "Ruth," Martha's voice was flat and steady. "Give it to me." She took the envelope. She didn't open it on the path with Ruth watching. She tucked it under her arm, said thank you for the dish, and waited until the woman's footsteps faded back down the hill before she sat down on the chopping block and read it. She read it twice. Then she folded it along the original crease, tucked it into her apron pocket, picked up the axe, and split the remaining 3 logs. Clean, even strokes. She needed to finish before the light went. Inside the cabin, her father was propped up in the bed by the far wall, the same position he'd been in for 6 months since the cough got bad enough that walking across the room made him dizzy. He was awake. He was almost always awake now, though he pretended to sleep when he thought it would spare her something. "Was that Ruth?" he asked. "Yes." Martha hung her coat on the hook by the door. "She brought stew." "What else did she bring?" She looked at him. He had her eyes, or she had his. Dark and direct, and not built for lying. She pulled the notice from her pocket and crossed the room and handed it to him. He read it. His hands shook slightly, but that was the illness, not the paper. 60 days, he said. "Yes. That's Gerald's doing. He's always been Genevieve Ashford's. I know whose doing it is, Papa." Martha took the notice back and set it on the table. "I'm going to figure it out." He looked at her for a long moment. And in that look was everything they didn't say to each other. The debt, the mine that had given out 3 winters ago, the years of her working 2 jobs in town while people commented on her size within earshot, and she'd gotten so good at not reacting that sometimes she couldn't tell anymore when she was actually fine and when she was just performing it. "Martha," he said, "you can't carry this one alone." "I'm not alone." She moved to the stove. "Callie and Tom will be home from school in an hour. We need dinner." That night, after her younger sister Callie, who was 14 and already showing signs of their mother's quickness, and her brother Tom, who was 11 and still young enough to believe things would work out, were both asleep, Martha sat at the kitchen table with a candle and a piece of paper and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding for 3 months. The numbers didn't change no matter how she arranged them. The mine debt was the original problem, but the loan against the cabin was the one that would kill them, and Genevieve Ashford had apparently decided that 60 days was more than enough time to sort out the affairs of a family she'd never thought worth noticing. Martha had heard the woman's name her whole life. The Ashford timber money was woven through the whole county, and Genevieve managed the family's local investments the way other women managed their households, with total authority and very little patience for anything that didn't perform. Martha blew out the candle before it burned all the way down. Even candles cost money. She went to bed and lay on her back in the dark, listening to her father's breathing through the thin wall, and thought about what options she had left. There was the Harmon family down in the valley who'd offered to buy the west parcel 2 years ago. There was her wages from the seamstress work she'd taken on last winter, which barely covered their food. There was nothing else. She thought about it until well past midnight, and then she stopped thinking and made herself sleep because exhausted people made bad decisions, and she could not afford a bad decision. She was outside before dawn, restarting the fire. She did not see the wagon come up the mountain road until it was already halfway up the hill, moving at the pace of something that was not in a hurry and not lost. It was a plain wagon, the kind farmers used, wood-sided, one horse that was brown and unremarkable except for the way it moved, which was smooth and unhurried, the kind of movement that usually only came from years of careful handling. The man driving it wore a coat that had been mended at the left elbow and boots that were good quality but old. He had a beard that wasn't decorative, the kind of beard a man got from being away from towns for a while, and he sat on the wagon bench with a looseness that meant he was comfortable, not careless. He stopped at the foot of her path and sat there a moment before he climbed down. "Martha Hollowbrook?" he said. "Depends who's asking." She had the axe in her hand, not threatening, just present. "My name is Gideon Frost." He stopped at a reasonable distance. "I heard in town you might be in a difficult situation. I'd like to talk to you about it, if you're willing." "Who told you about my situation?" He paused, and it was the kind of pause that wasn't evasive, just honest. "I've been in the area for a while. People talk. I wasn't looking for gossip. I was looking for something specific, and it seems like it might be a conversation worth having." Martha looked at him. She'd had plenty of experience judging what men wanted when they came calling, and most of the time it was something she didn't have or wasn't going to give. This one was harder to read. He wasn't looking at her the way men usually did, which was either with dismissal or with something worse than dismissal. He was looking at her the way someone looked at a door they wanted to know more about before they decided whether to knock. "What kind of conversation?" she said. "Can we sit somewhere?" She thought about it for 2 full seconds. Then she put the axe against the woodpile and said, "The step. I'm not bringing a stranger inside." "That's reasonable," he said, and followed her to the front step without any sign of offense. They sat on the step with the morning coming up gray behind the tree line, and Gideon Frost told her what he wanted without preamble, which she appreciated. He'd heard about the foreclosure. He said he could pay the debt, all of it, the bank loan and the mine debt both. And he could also ensure her father had medical care through the winter and money enough for her siblings to continue in school. In exchange, he was asking her to marry him. Martha didn't move. The cold air sat between them like a third party. "You don't know me," she said. "No, but I've heard about you." He wasn't rushing. "I heard you worked 2 jobs for 2 winters without complaint. I heard you managed the mine accounts for your father before the vein ran out and caught 3 different errors that would have cost him twice what they eventually lost. I heard you don't take charity and you don't make promises you can't keep." "You heard that from who?" "Various people." A pause. "I asked around." "You asked around about me?" The strangeness of it sat on her. Nobody had ever asked around about her for a good reason. "Why?" He turned and looked at her directly for the first time, and she noticed his eyes were a dark gray, the color of stone before rain. "Because I need a wife," he said, "and I don't want someone who's going to fall apart the first hard winter. I need someone who already knows what hard looks like and hasn't run from it." "That's not a romantic proposal." "No," he agreed. "It's not. I think you'd see through a romantic proposal." She almost laughed, not because it was funny exactly, but because he wasn't wrong, and she hadn't expected him to not be wrong. "What's in it for you?" she said. "Practically speaking, a partner, a real one." He looked back at the tree line. "Someone I can trust, someone who won't be there for my money." "What money?" She looked pointedly at the mended elbow, the plain wagon. He didn't answer that directly. The debt would be paid before we leave. I'd have the paperwork done with Gerald today. You think Genevieve Ashford's going to let Gerald unwind that foreclosure? The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. I think Gerald will do what the paperwork says. Something about the way he said it was peculiar, not arrogant exactly, more like a man who'd already checked the weight of the thing before he picked it up. Martha looked at her hands, which were rough from the axe and the cold and the work, and thought about what she was being asked. Not romance, not happiness, a practical agreement between two adults who needed something from each other. Her family would be safe, her father would have care, her siblings would have a future. And she would be married to a man she'd met 20 minutes ago and was being asked to trust on the basis of a few sentences and something in the steadiness of his eyes. If I say yes, she said slowly, and then I get up into those mountains and find out you're someone other than who you're presenting yourself to be, what then? He thought about it. She noticed he actually thought about it rather than immediately reassuring her. Then you'd have the right to leave. I wouldn't stop you. And the debt would stay paid. He said it simply. Your family would be secure regardless. She looked at him, the gray of his eyes, the steadiness of his hands. The wagon that was plain, but the horse that was something more than plain if you knew how to look. I want to talk to my father, she said. Of course. She went inside. Her father was awake, propped on his pillows, and he heard her out without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. What do you think of him? He asked. I think he's not who he's saying he is. Not exactly. Meaning I think there's more to it, but I can't tell if that's bad more or just more. Her father closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something there that looked very much like grief, and she understood it wasn't for her but for himself, for the position he'd put her in, for the years of trouble that had brought them to this step on this morning. Martha, he said, I would rather you were free to choose. I am free to choose, she said. That's why I'm choosing. He looked at her for a long time. You always were the strongest person in this family, he said. I just hope I didn't teach you to confuse strength with sacrifice. She kissed his forehead. I'll come back and visit. He said I could come back. She wasn't actually sure he'd said that, but she believed it. She went back outside. I'll do it, she said. Gideon Frost nodded once, like she'd confirmed something rather than decided it. Thank you, he said, and she noticed he didn't say she wouldn't regret it or any of the other things people said when they were trying to manage someone's expectations. He just said thank you. The news went through Pine Hollow in about 4 hours, which was faster than Martha had expected and about as pleasant as she'd anticipated. By the time she and Gideon were at the bank making the arrangements, she could feel the eyes through the window glass, and she heard the word shameless applied to him by a woman outside who didn't realize the window was cracked open. The word applied to her was worse, and she'd heard it before, and she kept her face exactly neutral and initialed, where Gerald pointed and did not look at Gideon to see how he was taking it. After, on the steps of the bank, a man she'd known her whole life, Frank Alderman, who ran the feed supply and had been kind to her for years, pulled her aside with an expression of genuine concern. Martha, I don't know what this man's told you, but a drifter's not the answer to your problems. He's not a drifter, she said. Then what is he? She looked at Frank. I'm not entirely sure, she said honestly. But he paid the bank in cash this morning and didn't haggle, and whatever he is, my father's going to have a doctor by the end of the week. That's enough for now. Frank looked at her the way people looked at you when they'd given up arguing but still thought you were wrong. She gave his arm a brief, warm press with her hand and walked back to where Gideon was waiting beside the wagon. They left the next morning, in the blue-gray dark before anyone else in Pine Hollow was properly awake. Martha had said goodbye to her father the night before, sitting with him for 2 hours while Callie and Tom slept, talking about small things. The garden in spring, the way the snow sounded on the roof in January, a dog they'd had when she was 7 that she'd almost forgotten. It wasn't the conversation she would have had if she'd known it was the last one. It was better for that. When she got up to leave, she pressed her forehead against his, the way she'd done as a child, and he put his hand on the back of her head and kept it there for a moment. "Come back when you can," he said. "I will," she said. And she meant it the way you mean things when you don't know how hard they'll become to keep. Tom cried a little, which he tried to hide. Callie didn't cry, but she held Martha's hand very tight on the step and said, "You'll write?" And Martha said yes, she would, and she would. She was determined about that. The wagon moved out of the yard in the early dark, and Gideon didn't say anything, which she was grateful for. She wasn't in a state for conversation. She watched the cabin until the trees took it, which didn't take long. After a while, she said, "How long is the journey?" 3 days, give or take. He kept his eyes on the road. The first day is the hardest stretch. Mountain roads? Yes. She looked at the horse, smooth-paced and unhurried in the cold morning. "Your horse is well trained," she said. "Yes." "Better than what a man of your appearance would usually keep." She felt rather than saw the slight tension that moved through him. "I found him." She didn't push it, not yet, but she filed it away in the same place she'd filed the quality of the saddle leather and the fact that the mended elbow of his coat was patched neatly from the inside, as if someone had done it properly rather than in haste, and the way the workers they'd passed at the edge of town had dropped their eyes when Gideon looked their way, the involuntary deference of people who knew someone and were trying not to show it. She'd been reading people her whole life. Most of them had never noticed. The first day of the journey was exactly as hard as he'd said. Narrow switchback roads climbing into country Martha had never traveled, the air thinning and turning colder as the hours passed. She didn't complain. She wasn't built for complaining, and it would have felt false anyway because the physical difficulty was something she could manage. It was the uncertainty she was working harder on. At midday, they stopped on a flat rock shelf overlooking a drop of maybe 300 feet to a creek below, the kind of view that made you aware of how large things were. Gideon handed her hard bread and dried meat without ceremony, and they ate in silence with the wind moving through the pines above them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "What are you not telling me?" He looked out at the drop. A long pause. Not evasive, she was starting to think that was just how he considered things. "More than I should probably be not telling you," he said. "That's not an answer." "I know." He broke off another piece of bread. "I'll tell you when we get there." "And that should satisfy me?" He looked at her then, direct, the way he'd been the first morning on her step. "No," he said. "It shouldn't. But I'm asking you to let it hold you a couple more days." She thought about what she could do if she refused. Walk back down the mountain, get to Pine Hollow in 2 days if the weather held. Walk back into the situation she'd walked out of, minus the debt, because he'd kept that part of his word. She could survive that. She was good at surviving. But she was also, she had to admit, curious. And curiosity was not something she allowed herself very often, because it had rarely led anywhere useful. 2 more days, she said. He nodded. That evening he built a fire in a way that was efficient and completely competent, the kind of practiced ease you got from doing something 10,000 times, and she watched without commenting. He made coffee with water he'd filtered from a stream using a method she'd never seen, some kind of collapsible kit that lived in a corner of the wagon box in a fitted leather case, and she drank the coffee and noticed how good it was. She was building a picture of him in her mind. She didn't have all the pieces yet, but the shape of the thing was starting to come clear. The second night he gave her the oilcloth side of the wagon to sleep under while he slept on the ground. And when she woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of wind changing direction and tasted snow in the air, she found that he'd already strung an additional canvas between 2 trees on the windward side without waking her. She lay in the quiet and thought about that. Not about romance. She wasn't at that part of anything, but about what it meant when someone anticipated your need without making a production of it. By the 3rd afternoon, the road had climbed as far as it could go and then leveled out onto a narrow mountain pass, the rock wall on one side and nothing but air on the other, and Gideon pulled the horse to a stop at the crest. "Come stand over here," he said. It was the first time he'd asked her to do something without explaining why. She got down from the wagon and walked to where he was standing, at the edge of the pass where the land fell away, and looked down. The world below her was nothing like what she'd expected. She had expected, she realized, a rough cabin. Perhaps a few acres of cleared land, the kind of hidden mountain homestead you heard about from people who'd gone into the high country and chosen to stay. What she saw instead was a valley. A real valley, deep and wide, sheltered on all sides by the mountain slopes, and within it more than she could immediately take in. Buildings, many of them, some log and some stone, arranged in the kind of order that suggested planning. Pastures, orchards. What appeared to be a mill near a river she could see glittering silver in the afternoon light. Roads. And at the center of it, elevated slightly on a natural rise, a house that was not a house in any sense she'd used the word before. It was substantial in the way of things that had been built to last generations. She stood at the edge of the pass for a long time and looked at it. Then she turned to look at Gideon. He was watching her face, not with satisfaction, she noticed, with something closer to wariness. "Your name," she said slowly, "is not Gideon Frost." "No," he said, "it's not." She waited. "Gideon Ashford," he said. "That's mine down there." The wind came up off the valley and hit her face with the cold of a place that was higher and more serious than Pine Hollow, and she stood in it and felt the full weight of what he'd just said. Ashford. She knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name. The Ashford timber interests reached halfway across the territory, and the money attached to them was the kind of money that shaped elections and built courthouses and could, she now understood, unwind a bank foreclosure in a single morning without anyone raising a serious objection. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and let the cold air do what cold air did, which was make you feel very clear and very awake. "You lied to me," she said. "I didn't tell you the full truth," he said. "That's not entirely the same thing, but I understand if you don't see the difference." "Why?" She kept her voice even. She was good at keeping her voice even. What was the point of the patched coat and the plain wagon and the story about being a mountain man? He looked at her steadily. "Because I needed to know if you'd come for me," he said, "or for what I have." She thought about that. It made a kind of sense she hated because it meant she understood it. She'd spent her whole life being evaluated by things that had nothing to do with who she actually was, and here was a man who'd done the same thing in the other direction, hiding what he had to see if someone would see past it. It didn't make it right, but she understood the shape of it. "You could have told me," she said. "You wouldn't have believed I was choosing you for yourself. You'd have thought there was some angle, something I wanted that had nothing to do with who you are." He paused. "Would you have believed me?" The honesty of the question hit her somewhere unguarded. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about things seriously, and she had to admit she wouldn't have. She would have spent the entire journey up the mountain wondering what he really wanted. "That doesn't make it right," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They stood at the edge of the pass with the valley below them, and she looked at it and thought about the offer he'd made her on her front step. The one where he'd said if she chose to leave, her family would be secure regardless. The offer he hadn't had to make. The one that had cost him something and hadn't gotten him anything. "If I turn around right now," she said, "and go back down the mountain, everything I told you stands," he said immediately. "The debt stays paid. The doctor has already arranged for your father. I'll have the schooling money sent monthly. You already arranged the doctor. Yesterday morning, before we left. I didn't mention it because I didn't want you to feel—" He stopped. "Obligated," she finished. "Yes." She looked at the valley a little longer. The house that wasn't a house, the mill near the Silver River, the small shapes of people moving between buildings in the late afternoon light. All of it his. And he'd come to her door in a mended coat, looking for someone who couldn't be bought. She thought about what that took, to hide yourself that way. She didn't agree with it, but she understood wanting to be seen as something other than what the world decided you were before you opened your mouth. "Gideon Ashford," she said. "Yes." If I actually stay, you don't hide things from me again, not about anything that affects me or mine. If you have something to tell me, you tell me." He held her gaze. "Agreed. And you understand I'm still angry about this. I'd be concerned if you weren't." She looked at the valley below. Her family was safe. That was real. Whatever else this was, whatever it became, her father had a doctor, and her siblings had a future, and that was a thing she had done, not had done for her. She had made this choice with her eyes open, and the eyes were only now opening a little wider. She turned back to the wagon. "Show me the way down," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he was going to say something, but he didn't. He just walked back to the horse and took the bridle and led them forward toward the pass and the road that wound down into the valley below. Martha rode down into Ashford Valley in the last light of the third day, watching the shapes of the place come into focus as they descended, the stone buildings taking on their individual character, the people near the mill looking up as the wagon passed, the way the main road was kept in better condition than anything she'd seen coming up the mountain. And she kept her face forward and her thoughts to herself and started quietly, methodically, the way she did everything, to figure out what kind of life this was going to be. She didn't know yet about Genevieve Ashford. She didn't know yet about the things Genevieve had already started putting in motion the moment she'd heard her nephew had come back from the mountain with a wife. She didn't know about Denver, or the governor's reception, or what would be asked of her in a ballroom full of people whose only business was deciding what other people were worth. She knew only the valley below her, getting larger with every turn of the wagon wheel, and the man walking beside the horse in a mended coat that she now understood had been a kind of costume, and the strange, uncertain fact of her own choice, made freely, held with both hands, in the cold light of a mountain pass at the edge of everything she'd known. Martha Hollowbrook, soon to be Martha Ashford, though she hadn't yet thought about that, rode down into the hidden valley and kept her eyes wide open. She had always survived by seeing what was actually there. She suspected she was going to need that skill more than ever. The first person Martha met at the bottom of the road was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s named Hector, who served as the head of the valley's work crews, and who looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the careful middle of someone who had learned to wait and see. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and the title landed on her like something dropped from a height. She didn't flinch. "Martha's fine," she said. Hector glanced at Gideon, who gave him nothing, and then looked back at her with something that might have been the very beginning of approval. "I'll show you to the house," he said. The main house was larger up close than it had appeared from the pass, built from the valley's own stone in a way that suggested it had grown rather than been constructed, additions added over decades as the need arose, so that it had an uneven, layered quality that Martha found more interesting than if it had been perfect. The entrance hall had a stone floor worn smooth in the center from years of foot traffic and smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, which were smells she understood, and that helped. Gideon walked her through the ground floor without ceremony, pointing out the kitchen, the study, the large room off the back that served as a kind of meeting space for the operations managers. He didn't perform it. He wasn't showing off. He talked about the house the way a person talked about a place they actually lived in, mentioning that the third step on the main staircase had a loose board he kept forgetting to have fixed, and that the kitchen's north window stuck in wet weather. She listened and said little and looked at everything. The bedroom he showed her was not his. It was down the hall, a room with its own fireplace and a window that faced the eastern slope, and she understood without it being said that he was giving her space she hadn't asked for, but apparently he'd guessed she'd need. She appreciated it without saying so. "I'll have water brought up," he said from the doorway. "I can get my own water." "I know you can. I'm offering." She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe in the mended coat he still hadn't taken off, and she thought again about the deliberateness of it, the way he'd constructed a version of himself designed to be seen as less than what he was. It still sat wrong with her, but she was tired from 3 days of mountain road, and she didn't have the energy to be wrong with something and do anything about it simultaneously. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left, and she sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands on her knees and took 2 full breaths, and then got up and started unpacking the single bag she'd brought, because sitting still felt like something she couldn't afford yet. The house had a staff, which she hadn't fully anticipated. Not many. A cook named Della, 2 women who handled the cleaning and laundry, an older man called Silas who managed what seemed to be the household accounts, and who looked at Martha over his spectacles with an expression of polite assessment that she found less intimidating than he probably intended. She'd been assessed her whole life by people who thought she couldn't tell she was being assessed. Della was the first one who spoke to her without measuring her first. She was a square-built woman in her 60s with flour on her apron and very little patience for anything that wasn't practical. And she met Martha in the kitchen the first morning with a cup of coffee already poured and a direct look that said she had decided to take the measure of this situation herself rather than wait for someone to tell her what to think. "You cook?" Della said. "Yes." "What?" "Whatever's needed. I can do bread, stew, preserved food for winter. I'm better at practical than fancy." Della handed her the coffee. "Good. Fancy is my department. Practical we always need more of." She turned back to the stove. "Breakfast in 20 minutes. You can set the table if you want something to do." Martha set the table. It was, she thought, the first moment in 2 days that she'd felt like herself. Gideon appeared for breakfast looking like he'd been up for hours, which he probably had. He sat across from her at the long kitchen table. They didn't use the formal dining room for daily meals, she'd noticed, which told her something about how he actually lived versus how the house suggested he might. And they ate Della's eggs and the good bread in a silence that was not entirely comfortable, but was at least honest. "I need to show you the operation today," he said, "if you're up for it." "What kind of operation?" "The whole thing. Timber, the mill, the ranching side, the orchard. It'll take most of the day." She put down her fork. "Why?" He looked up. "Because it's yours now, too. You should know what you're part of." She held that for a moment. It was the right answer. It was also a surprising answer, and she'd learned to pay attention to surprising answers because they were usually more revealing than the expected ones. "All right," she said. They spent the full day moving through the valley, and Gideon did not explain things in the way of a man showing a woman something she couldn't be expected to understand. He explained things the way you explain them to someone you expected to have questions. And when she had questions, he answered them without condescension and without surprise, as if he'd been anticipating she'd ask exactly that. She asked about the timber operation's scale and how they managed the rate of cutting to avoid running out of old growth within a decade, a problem she'd seen destroy 2 smaller operations in the county before she was 20. He looked at her sideways when she asked it. "We rotate sections," he said. 15-year cycles on the east slope, 20 on the west where the growth is slower. My father started it. I expanded it. Most operations don't bother. Most operations are thinking about this year's profit, he said. I'm thinking about what this valley looks like in 50 years. She thought about that through the rest of the morning. The workers they encountered during the tour were the real information. Martha had learned early that you could know almost everything important about a person by watching how the people who worked for them behaved around them. The workers in Ashford Valley were not afraid of Gideon, which was the first thing she noticed. They were respectful. There was a clear authority in how he moved through the spaces. But it was the respect you gave someone you trusted rather than someone you feared, and that was a meaningful difference. Several of them looked at her with open curiosity. One older woman working near the orchard gave her a long look and then a short nod that felt like it carried real weight, though Martha couldn't yet tell why. By mid-afternoon, they were sitting on a split-rail fence at the edge of the upper pasture eating the lunch Della had packed without telling them she was packing it. And the valley spread below them in the pale winter light. And Martha found herself thinking that if she'd drawn a picture of what a life worth fighting for might look like, it wouldn't have been so different from this. That thought made her uncomfortable because she hadn't come here to be won over by scenery. "Tell me about the ant," she said. Gideon went still in the way of someone who'd been expecting a question and still wasn't ready for it. "What did you hear?" "Nothing specific. I heard the name Ashford my whole life in connection with the county's money. I know it's a family operation. You have a family." She looked at him. "And you came to Pine Hollow wearing a disguise, which tells me there was a reason you didn't want to find a wife through the usual channels, which means something about the usual channels was a problem, which probably means someone in your family had opinions." He was quiet for a moment. "You worked that out from a coat with a mended elbow?" "I work it out from everything," she said. "The coat was just the beginning." He looked at the valley. When he talked about Genevieve, it was in the careful way of someone who had a complicated feeling about something and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. His aunt was his mother's older sister, and she'd been involved in the Ashford business interests since before Gideon was born, initially as a partner and after his parents died as a kind of de facto authority over the family's broader relationships and reputation. She had opinions. She had significant opinions about what the Ashford name required and what it could not afford, and a wife chosen from the mountain poor did not appear anywhere on her list of acceptable futures. "She doesn't know yet," he said, "that I've come back with you. She will within the week." "How will she find out?" "She has people in the valley who tell her things." "In your own valley?" "It's complicated." He said it like a man who'd made peace with something that still occasionally annoyed him. "She has money in the operation. Not control, but investment. It gives her a foothold she's always used to stay informed." Martha thought about that. A foothold. Information. The particular kind of power that came from being present without being visible. "What will she do?" Martha said. "Come here," he said. "She'll come here and she'll make her opinion known, and she'll try to find a way to remove the problem." "The problem being me?" "Yes." She looked at the valley. 15-year timber rotation cycles. 20 on the west slope. A house that had been added to over generations because a family had stayed and built something. And somewhere outside it, a woman with investment capital and opinions and people in the valley who sent her information. "When she comes," Martha said, "don't try to manage it. Don't put me somewhere I won't hear what's being said. I'd rather know." Gideon looked at her. "She's not an easy person to deal with." "I've dealt with Genevieve Ashford types my whole life," Martha said. "They just usually had less money." Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite admiration, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. "All right," he said. They came back down to the house as the light was going, and Della had dinner ready, and they ate again at the kitchen table, and Martha thought that this ordinary, functional, slightly awkward dailiness was probably more real than anything dramatic that would come after it. She held on to it because she knew what was coming would be harder, and it was useful to have something solid to hold on to when things got harder. Genevieve Ashford arrived on the 5th day. Martha knew before anyone said anything because she heard the horses, multiple horses, good ones, moving fast down the valley road, and she looked out the kitchen window and saw the carriage, which was not the kind of carriage someone used for a casual visit. It was the kind of carriage that was a statement. She was drying her hands on a kitchen towel when Gideon appeared in the doorway. "She's here," he said. "I know." Martha folded the towel over the rail. "Is there a particular way you'd like me to—" "Be yourself," he said immediately. She gave him a look. "That's not an instruction. That's a platitude." "I mean, don't perform anything. Don't try to be what she expects or what she doesn't expect. Just be who you are." "Who I am is a miner's daughter from Pine Hollow who's been married less than a week to a man whose real name she found out at the top of a mountain pass." "That's exactly who you are," he said, without any indication he found this problematic. "And I'd like that person in the room when Genevieve arrives, not a version of her who's trying to manage my aunt." She looked at him for a moment. Then she unfolded the kitchen towel and refolded it and hung it back over the rail because it had been crooked. "Fine," she said. "Let's go." Genevieve Ashford was smaller than Martha had imagined, which was the first surprise. She'd constructed a larger woman in her mind, broader, the physical presence matching the reputation. The real Genevieve was compact and precise, dressed in dark blue traveling clothes that had not wrinkled despite however long she'd been in the carriage. With silver hair pulled back so neatly, it looked architectural, and eyes that were a very clear, very cold green, and that moved to Martha the moment she came through the door and stayed there. Behind her were two men in suits who managed to look like lawyers without anyone saying they were lawyers, and a young woman who was clearly her personal secretary and who kept her eyes on a small leather notebook. "Gideon," Genevieve said without looking at him. "Introduce me." "Aunt Genevieve, this is Martha, my wife." Martha. The name came out of Genevieve like she was testing the weight of a thing she'd found in the road. "Martha what?" "Ashford," Martha said. "Currently." Genevieve's eyes didn't change, but something around them did. A slight tightening that might have been displeasure or might have been acknowledgement that the woman in front of her was not going to be as manageable as she'd hoped. Sit down, Genevieve said to the room generally, and sat in the chair by the fireplace as if she'd been sitting in it for 40 years. They sat. Gideon took the chair across from his aunt. Martha took the small settee to the side, not because she was deferring, but because it was the position from which she could see both of them clearly, and seeing clearly was something she had always prioritized. "I'll be direct," Genevieve said, which Martha suspected was what she always said before being something other than direct. "This is unexpected, and unexpected is a word I use carefully. Gideon has certain obligations. To this family's legacy, to the business relationships I have spent 30 years cultivating, and to the standards those relationships expect. A marriage contracted in," she paused, "in the manner this one apparently was, with someone whose background is unknown to anyone with a stake in this enterprise, creates complications." "What kind of complications?" Martha said. Genevieve looked at her. It was a measuring look, but Martha had been looked at that way her entire life, and she'd stopped finding it destabilizing somewhere around age 16. "The kind," Genevieve said, "that affect investment confidence." "Whose investment?" A brief pause. "Several of the company's major partners will be gathering in Denver in 6 weeks for a conference. The governor's reception. It is a significant event, and Gideon's attendance is expected. His wife's attendance would naturally be noted." "And you're concerned about what would be noted," Martha said. "I'm concerned about the enterprise," Genevieve said, which was not a denial. Gideon shifted in his chair. "Genevieve, I'm not finished." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I have arranged Gideon for a meeting with Judge Harlan Prentice next month. He has reviewed the family compact and he has observations about what happens to the inheritance structure when a principal partner makes decisions that materially affect the confidence of the enterprise's other stakeholders." The room went quiet in a particular way, the quiet of something important having been said. Martha looked at Gideon. His jaw had tightened, but his expression was controlled. She understood that Genevieve had been preparing this for a while. The judge, the meeting already arranged, the conference in Denver is the theater where the plan would play out. This was not improvisation. This was architecture. "Let me make sure I understand," Martha said, and both Gideon and Genevieve looked at her, Genevieve with a cool attention that suggested she was now deciding how much of a problem Martha actually was. "You've brought a legal challenge to the inheritance based on the argument that the marriage damages the company's interests." "A precautionary review," Genevieve said. "And the Denver reception is where the damage would be demonstrated. The partners see me, form an opinion, and that becomes the evidence." Genevieve said nothing, which was its own answer. "That's a reasonable strategy," Martha said. "If it works." Genevieve's eyes narrowed slightly. She was, Martha thought, someone who was not accustomed to having her strategies described as reasonable rather than argued against. "I beg your pardon?" "I mean, you've built it carefully. The judge, the conference, the timeline, it's well constructed." Martha kept her voice even. "I just don't think it's going to work." "Martha," Gideon said, and she could hear in the single word both caution and something else, something that sounded almost like, "Go on." Genevieve leaned back in her chair the very smallest amount, which in a woman that controlled probably constituted a significant reaction. "Why not?" she said. "Because you've designed it around what you expect me to do, and I'm not going to do it." "Which is?" "Fall apart in Denver, get overwhelmed by people with money and sophisticated manners. Give the partners something to point at." Martha looked at the older woman steadily. "You've been underestimating people based on how they look and where they come from your whole life. It's worked well for you. I understand why you'd keep doing it, but I've been underestimated my whole life, and what I've learned is that the person doing the underestimating tends to build their plan around a mistake." The room was extremely quiet. Genevieve looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Gideon. Then she looked back at Martha. "That is," she said, "a very confident speech for someone in your position." "I know," Martha said. "I have that problem sometimes." Something happened in Genevieve's face that was too complicated to read all at once. Something that was not warmth, but was perhaps the first moment she was seeing Martha, rather than the category she'd put Martha in. It lasted less than 2 seconds, and then the green eyes were cool and unreadable again. "We'll see," Genevieve said, and stood, which apparently concluded the meeting. After she left, after the carriage and the lawyers and the secretary had gone back down the valley road, Gideon sat in the chair by the fireplace for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at Martha. "That was either very brave or very inadvisable," he said. "Probably both," she said. "What's the actual legal situation? The inheritance?" He rubbed the back of his neck, which was the first genuinely unguarded gesture she'd seen from him, a person reaching for something when they didn't have it. "There's a clause in the family compact. It's legitimate. She's not inventing it. If a majority of the major partners indicate that a principal decision, including marriage, damages the business's standing, it triggers a review that could transfer decision-making authority to the broader partnership board. And Genevieve controls enough of that board. She has influence, not outright control, but in Denver, with the right room and the right impression. How long do we have before Denver?" 6 weeks. Martha looked at the fire that had burned down to coals while Genevieve was talking. "Then I need to understand everything about the company's finances and community relationships before we go, not the surface, the real numbers." She looked at him. "I need to know what I'm walking into." He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one where he was recalibrating something he'd assumed about her. "You're not considering not going?" "No." "Genevieve will... Denver is designed to..." "I know what it's designed to do," Martha said. "I'm going. I've survived ridicule my entire life. A room full of wealthy people who've decided what I am before I open my mouth is not a new situation. It's just a more expensive room." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and went to the study and came back with a ledger, thick and worn at the spine, and set it on the table in front of her. "The last 3 years' accounts," he said. "Real numbers." She pulled the ledger toward her and opened it, and that was how they spent the evening. Not dramatically, not with declarations or confrontations, just the two of them at the table with the accounts open between them while the fire rebuilt itself, and Della sent in coffee without being asked, and the valley outside the window settled into the particular quiet of a mountain night. Martha read the numbers carefully. She asked questions, and Gideon answered them, and they talked about timber yield projections and the costs of the worker housing he'd been upgrading and the school at the valley's south end that was 2 rooms now and needed to be 4. She had the kind of mind for figures that came from years of making small amounts of money do large amounts of work, and she caught things in the accounts that surprised her. Not problems, but missed opportunities, places where the operation was underselling its own long-term value. She marked them with a piece of charcoal because there was no pen on the table and she didn't want to lose the thread. Gideon watched her make the 3rd mark and said, "You went through our accounts in Pine Hollow." "I managed them for 4 years, for a mine that was failing." "A failing operation is where you learn the most about accounts," she said. "When everything's going well, you can miss things. When there's no margin for error, you learn what every number actually means." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's the mark on page 31? Your timber lease on the northern slope. You're charging the rate from 8 years ago. The market's moved." She looked up. "You're leaving money on the table, enough to fund 2 more rooms on the school." He looked at the page, then at her. He didn't say anything, but she had the sense that he was recalibrating again, and this time further. They worked until past midnight, and then Martha closed the ledger and said she was going to sleep, and Gideon said goodnight in the direct, uncomplicated way he had, and she went upstairs to the room with the east-facing window and sat on the edge of the bed again, the way she had the first night. She thought about Genevieve and the judge and the ballroom in Denver that she hadn't seen yet but could already picture, the silk dresses and the careful laughter, and the eyes that would move over her and make their calculations. She thought about the mended coat and the plain wagon, and a man who'd hidden himself to find someone who wouldn't be blinded by what he had. She thought about her father in the cabin on the hill, who had a doctor now, and Callie, who had asked, "Will you write?" and Tom, who had cried and tried to hide it. She thought about the timber lease marked on page 31. She thought about what it meant to walk into a room where everyone had already decided what you were. She thought about how much she'd already walked out of rooms like that, how she was still here, She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel for just a few minutes the full weight of what the last week had been. The foreclosure notice, the wagon, the mountain pass, the valley spread below her in the winter light, Genevieve's cold green eyes, the ledger and the charcoal marks, and the school that needed to be 4 rooms instead of 2. She let herself feel it, and then she set it down the way she set down heavy things when she needed her hands free. She had 6 weeks before Denver. She was going to use all of them. The 6 weeks before Denver were not what Martha had expected, which was becoming a pattern in her life since she'd climbed into Gideon's wagon. She had expected the valley to feel temporary, like a place she was passing through while some larger decision got made about her future. Instead, it pulled her in the way work always had, not through beauty or comfort, but through problems that needed solving, and Ashford Valley had no shortage of those. The timber lease on the northern slope was the first thing she fixed, or rather, the first thing she identified clearly enough that Gideon could fix it with the right documentation. She spent 3 days with the old contracts and the current market figures Silas kept in a separate ledger, cross-referencing rates and calculating what 6 years of undercharging had actually cost the operation. When she put the number in front of Gideon, he looked at it for a long time without speaking. "That's not a small error," he said finally. "No." She sat across from him in the study, which she'd started using in the mornings because the light was good. "It's not an error exactly. It's inertia. Someone set the rate and nobody revisited it because the operation was profitable enough that the gap didn't show. My father set that rate." "I know." She said it carefully. "It was the right rate in the year he set it. Things change." He looked at the number again. Then he picked up the pen and started writing the revision letter, and she noticed he didn't ask her to leave the room while he did it, didn't treat the decision as something that needed to happen away from her. She filed that away. The school at the valley's south end was the second thing she got into, and that happened less by plan than by accident. She'd walked down there on a Tuesday morning because she'd wanted to see the building. Not the idea of it, but the actual structure, the roof, the windows, the stove situation. And she'd arrived during the school day and stood at the back of the single room while a young woman named Polly tried to teach 12 children ranging from 6 to 14 with one reader and a chalkboard that had a crack running through its center. Polly was 22 and earnest and clearly talented, and she was losing the older children because she didn't have enough material to keep them challenged while also handling the younger ones. Martha watched for 20 minutes and then slipped out before the lesson ended and walked back to the house with her hands in her pockets and her mind working. That evening, she told Gideon she wanted to write to the county education office about supplementary materials. He said, "Go ahead." She wrote the letter and then wrote 4 more. To a book supplier in the capital, to a teacher's training school, to a woman she'd heard of who'd organized a lending library in a mining town 3 counties east. She didn't tell him about all of them because they were still just letters, and she didn't see the point of announcing intentions before they were actions. This was how she'd always worked, quietly, with her head down, until there was something to show. What she hadn't anticipated was how the valley's people would respond to her, which was not with the warmth of immediate acceptance. She hadn't expected that, but with something more useful, which was watchful interest. They were Gideon's people, which meant they were careful about outsiders, which meant any trust would be earned rather than given, which suited Martha because earned things held better. The woman from the orchard, the one who had given her the considered nod on the first day's tour, came to the house on the 3rd week. Her name was Agnes Birch. She was in her late 60s, and she ran the orchard operation and had apparently been doing so since Gideon's father's time. She knocked on the kitchen door, which Martha later understood was a meaningful choice. The kitchen door rather than the front, which was how people who considered themselves part of the household announced themselves, not visitors. Della let her in and then made herself scarce with the particular discretion of someone who knew this was a conversation they shouldn't be part of. Agnes sat at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at Martha the way very old practical women looked at things they were trying to understand, not unkindly, but without pretense. "You've been asking about the school," Agnes said. "Yes." "And the northern lease?" Martha looked at her. "News travels. In a valley this size, everything travels." Agnes's hands were deeply lined, the knuckles swollen from decades of outdoor work. "I want to know what you're doing here." I live here. That's not what I mean. The old woman leaned forward slightly. Genevieve's been telling people you're temporary, that Gideon made a mistake and he'll realize it. She's been saying that to the partners, to the men on the board. Some of them believe her because it's easier to believe her than to think about it. Martha kept her face level. What do you believe? Agnes looked at her hands, then back at Martha. I believe you looked at that school and saw a problem, and I believe you went home and wrote letters instead of asking someone else to write them. She paused. Genevieve Ashford has never once walked into that schoolroom, not in 30 years. That doesn't make me better than her, Martha said. It just makes me different. Agnes looked at her for another long moment. No, she said, it doesn't make you better, but it makes you real. She pushed back from the table. I wanted to see you for myself. Genevieve describes you one way. The way people talk around the valley is another way. I needed to see which one was closer. And? Agnes stood. I'll be at the harvest meeting on Friday, she said, which was not an answer but was, Martha understood, entirely an answer. She was at the harvest meeting on Friday. So were 9 other people Martha hadn't met yet, valley residents and operation workers, and the woman who ran the medical cabin at the eastern end. The meeting had apparently happened quarterly for 20 years, a practical gathering about the valley's shared concerns, and Martha sat in the back and listened and said nothing, because she was still learning the shape of the place, and she knew better than to speak before she understood what she was speaking into. But she listened. And what she heard told her a great deal about what Ashford Valley needed, and what it feared, and what it had always wanted someone to notice about it. Gideon noticed that she'd started coming home from errands with mud on her boots that suggested she'd been farther afield than the main road. He didn't ask about it directly, which she appreciated. They were still in the early careful phase of figuring out how 2 people with strong, independent habits shared a space, and they were navigating it the way both of them navigated most things, which was practically and without excess sentiment. What they had was not romance. Not yet. It was something earlier, and in some ways more durable, which was mutual respect building slowly through observed competence. She saw how he handled a dispute between 2 crew managers without taking sides but without being weak about it. He saw how she handled Silas, who had been resistant to her access to the household accounts, not by confronting him but by simply knowing the numbers better than he did until resistance became pointless. They talked most easily in the evenings, at the kitchen table after Della had gone home, when there was no one to perform anything for. Those conversations were where she learned the most about him, that he'd been managing the valley since 23 when his father died, that the burden of it had shaped him into someone who trusted very slowly and held things very close, that the disguise in Pine Hollow had not been just practicality, but also a genuine relief, the pleasure of being nobody for a while. Did you enjoy it? She asked one evening, being poor Gideon Frost. He thought about it, which was always how he answered the questions that mattered. Yes and no, there's a freedom in it. Nobody wants anything from you, but it's also, you're always aware it's not true, that you can end it whenever you want. Real poverty doesn't have an exit. No, she said, it doesn't. He looked at her. I know I got that wrong. You got several things wrong. She wasn't saying it cruelly. But you're aware of them. That's something. 2 weeks before Denver, a letter arrived from her brother Tom, written in the careful handwriting of a boy who took letters seriously. Their father was holding steady. The doctor was good. Callie had started helping the postmaster's wife with some clerical work for extra money. Tom himself was doing well in school. He had signed it Your Brother Thomas, which was new, the full name, the beginning of a boy deciding who he was going to be. Martha read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then put it in her apron pocket and went back to what she'd been doing, which was working through the partnership compact, looking for the clause Gideon had mentioned. She'd been looking for it for 3 days. She found it on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, buried in a subsection of the original compact that had been amended twice and cross-referenced in a way that suggested whoever wrote it had not wanted it to be easily found. She read it twice, then a 3rd time, making sure she had it right. Then she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. The clause was real. Genevieve hadn't invented it. If the major partners defined in the compact as any group holding more than 40% of the invested capital, indicated in a formal proceeding that a principal partner's decision had materially damaged the company's standing. The inheritance structure could be reviewed by a judge who would have the authority to transfer operational control to the partnership board for a period of up to 10 years. Genevieve controlled through her own investment and through the partners she'd cultivated over 30 years, something very close to that 40% threshold. Not quite there, Martha had worked that out from Silas's records, but close enough that a sufficiently bad showing in Denver could tip one or two of the independent partners across the line. But there was something else. There was another clause, 3 pages later, that Genevieve apparently either hadn't found or had decided wasn't worth worrying about. Martha read it again to be certain. She got up and went to find Gideon. He was out near the mill, talking to Hector about something involving a conveyor mechanism that wasn't running right, and he looked up when she came around the corner of the building. Something in her face made him finish the sentence he was in the middle of and excuse himself. "What is it?" he said when they were out of earshot of the mill. "I found a counter clause," she said, "in the compact, Section 14, subsection C." "I know Section 14. "Did you read subsection C?" A pause. "No one's ever invoked subsection C. It's theoretical." "It's not theoretical," she said. "It's real, and it applies to us." She had the pages with her, folded in her apron pocket, and she handed them to him. "Read from the 3rd paragraph." He read. She watched his face while he did, which was the most useful thing to watch. He read slowly and then stopped, and went back and read part of it again. "A marriage that demonstrably benefits the company's community standing and its relationships with the territories it operates in," he said, half to himself. "And the surrounding communities," she said. "The clause protects against the inheritance challenge if the marriage can be shown to actively benefit both the operation and the people it depends on. It was written by your grandfather. I think he wrote it because he was worried about a different situation, a partner who might marry someone purely for the money and damage community trust. But the language covers our situation too." "Denver," he said slowly. "If we go to Denver and I lose the challenge, you invoke the counter clause. But it requires demonstration, not just our word. Evidence." She'd been thinking about this since she'd found the clause. The school materials, the lease revision and what we're doing with the revenue, the medical cabin expansion I've been writing to the county about, the harvest meeting and what the Valley residents would be willing to say formally. She paused. "It requires us to have built something real, not for the clause, actually real." He looked at her. "You've been doing all of that since the first week." "I've been doing it because it needed doing," she said. "I didn't know about the clause." "But it works anyway." "It works anyway," she agreed, "if we can document it." He folded the pages carefully and gave them back to her and stood there in the cold outside the mill, with the sound of the mechanism Hector was still working on coming through the wall. And Martha had the sense of something shifting in him, a weight being redistributed in a way that let him stand differently. "Denver is still the first battle," he said. "I know. Genevieve won't show her hand until the reception. She'll wait until she has the room and the judges present and the partners are all there, and then she'll raise the challenge formally." "I know," Martha said again. "I need a dress." He blinked. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "A dress. For the governor's reception. I don't have anything appropriate. Della was telling me about a dressmaker in town who comes to the valley sometimes. I'd like to send word." Gideon looked at her with an expression that was by now familiar to her, the recalibration expression, the one he got when she'd done or said something that moved what he understood about her. "I'll have Silas arrange it," he said. "I'll arrange it myself." She tucked the pages back in her pocket. "I just need to know the dressmaker's name." The dressmaker was a woman named Frances Gould, who came out from town 3 days later with a serious face and a case full of fabric samples and the contained professional air of someone who had dressed many women and been surprised by very few of them. She looked at Martha without the flicker of adjustment that Martha usually noticed in people who hadn't been warned about her size. And Martha understood that Frances Gould had made dresses for every kind of woman and was not particularly interested in making judgments, which made her immediately likable. They sat together for an hour going through the samples, and Frances asked questions about the occasion and the setting and the kind of impression Martha wanted to make, and Martha said something she'd been thinking about for a while. "I don't want to look like I'm trying to fit in," she said, "and I don't want to look like I'm defying anything, either. I want to look like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Frances looked at her. Then she reached into the case and pulled out a fabric the color of deep water, a blue-green that was not fashionable in the current Denver season, but was, Martha thought, exactly right, and held it against her arm. "This," Frances said, "and we'll do it properly. None of this hiding business. Proper construction, something that fits you the way good things fit." Martha looked at the fabric. "How long?" 10 days. I'll need 2 fittings." "You have them." The first fitting was fine. The second fitting happened the same afternoon Genevieve made her second visit to the valley, and Martha found out about Genevieve's arrival while standing on a wooden fitting platform in Frances's workroom off the kitchen. And her first reaction was that Genevieve had chosen the timing deliberately, which told her something important about how Genevieve thought. She finished the fitting. She was not going to leave a fitting half done because someone had shown up. When she came out, Genevieve was in the entrance hall with one of her suited men and the secretary with the notebook, and she looked at Martha with the cool green eyes and said, "I heard you've been busy." "I've been useful," Martha said. "There's a difference." Genevieve's expression shifted slightly. She had, Martha was beginning to understand, a narrow range of visible reaction, but within that range there were gradations if you looked closely enough. This particular shift was the one that meant she'd received information she was adding to her calculations. "The partners will be reviewing the Valley's operation reports before Denver," Genevieve said. "I've arranged for a preliminary meeting. Gideon should know." "I'll tell him," Martha said. "There will also be a formal documentation review. Any material changes to the operation contracts in the last 60 days will be examined." "That's reasonable," Martha said. "You don't seem concerned." "Should I be?" Genevieve studied her for a moment. There was something in it now that was almost like genuine curiosity, the faintest fracture in the certainty she carried. "Most women in your position would be," she said. "What is my position?" Martha asked, and kept her voice entirely neutral, not combative, just actually asking. "A woman from nothing who has married into more than she could have imagined," Genevieve said, and there was no cruelty in it, which made it worse somehow. She said it as pure fact, the way you describe weather. Martha looked at her. "I've spent my whole life being told what I am and what I come from and what that means about where I belong. I've heard it from people with more money than you and less. It's never been as true as the person saying it thought." She paused. "I know you're planning something for Denver. I know you have the judge and the partners, and you've been working on this longer than Gideon and I have been married. I'm not going to pretend I'm not worried about it, but I'm going to go anyway." Genevieve looked at her for a long, still moment. "Why?" she said, and it was the most genuine thing she'd said in either conversation. "Because you're not the only one who's been building something," Martha said. She stepped aside and gestured toward the study, where Gideon was waiting, and Genevieve walked through, and Martha stood in the entrance hall for a moment with her hand flat against the wall and her heart going faster than she wanted it to, because this was the thing no one could see. She was afraid. Not of Genevieve exactly, but of the particular cruelty of very public failure, the kind that happened in a bright room in front of everyone and that people remembered and retold for years. She was afraid of that. She had always been afraid of it, but fear had never yet been sufficient reason not to walk through a door. Della appeared from the kitchen with a look that said she'd been listening from a strategic position. "Coffee?" she said. "Yes," Martha said, "and maybe something to eat. I think it's going to be a long afternoon." The preliminary meeting with the partners happened 4 days before they left for Denver, conducted by letter and intermediary since the partners were already gathering in the city, and Gideon came out of his study at the end of it looking like a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected. "Genevieve has Whitmore and Chen," he said. Whitmore and Chen were the 2 largest independent partners, the ones who, combined with Genevieve's investment share, would clear the 40% threshold. "She doesn't have Hargrove, not yet. Hargrove is undecided." "What does Hargrove care about?" Martha said. "Stability, long-term value. He's not interested in drama. He's interested in whether the operation is going to be worth more in 20 years than it is now." "Then Hargrove is the conversation," Martha said. "Not the room, not the reception. Hargrove specifically. The reception is where she'll make her move, publicly, with the judge present. I know, but if Hargrove is already decided before we walk into that room, she stopped. Can you arrange a meeting with him before the reception? He's arriving the night before. Dinner, she said. Private dinner. You, me, Hargrove. Not about the challenge, about the operation's future and what we're building. Gideon looked at her. If I request a private meeting, it looks defensive. Have Hargrove request it, she said. Send him the revised lease agreement and the school documentation and the valley improvement plan we've been putting together. Don't ask for a meeting. Just send him the material and see what he does. And if he doesn't reach out? Then we go to the reception and we deal with the room, she said. But I think he will. Hargrove reached out on the second day, which was faster than Martha had expected, and which told Gideon that the material had landed the way she'd thought it would. The night before they left for Denver, Martha sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to Tom and Callie. She told them about the valley, the school, the orchard, the way the mill sound traveled up to the house on still mornings. She told them she was going to Denver for a few days, and that she would write when she was back. She did not tell them about Genevieve or the judge, but she, or the 40% threshold, or the ballroom where all of it was going to happen. Tom was 11, Callie was 14. They didn't need to carry that. She sealed the letter and went upstairs and stood at the window that faced the eastern slope and looked out at the dark mountain, which was the same mountain she'd come over on the third day of the journey, and which now looked different from this side, not as a barrier but as a wall around something worth keeping. She had been in this valley for 6 weeks. She had been married, technically, practically, for 6 weeks, to a man she'd known for less than a day before she'd agreed to it, and what she felt about that was still complicated and probably would be for some time. But she understood him better now, the steadiness and the caution and the way he held his humor close like something he'd learned not to spend too freely. She understood why he'd gone to Pine Hollow in a mended coat. She didn't fully forgive it, but she understood it, and understanding was often the beginning of the longer work. She thought about the dress Frances had made, hanging now in the wardrobe, the deep blue-green, properly constructed, the kind of thing that didn't apologize for the person wearing it. She thought about Genevieve's question. Why? She thought about subsection C, buried in the compact like something someone had planted for a future they couldn't quite see. She thought about Agnes Birch's hands flat on the kitchen table and the considered nod from the orchard, and the 12 children in one room with a cracked chalkboard, and a teacher who was doing everything she could with what she had. Denver would be what it was going to be. She would walk in knowing what she knew and carrying what she'd built, and trusting that the room, however hostile, was just a room, and she had walked out of rooms like it before, and she had always still been standing after. She went to bed and slept better than she'd expected. In the morning, they left for Denver. Denver was louder than Martha had expected and colder than she'd hoped. The kind of city cold that came off stone buildings and cobbled streets and had nowhere soft to land. They arrived the afternoon before the reception, in a hired coach from the rail station that was nicer than anything Martha had ridden in before, though she didn't say so. She watched the city through the window and cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. Not with wonder exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who knew they were going to need to navigate a place and was gathering information before they had to. The hotel Gideon had arranged was on the main avenue, 4 stories of pale stone, with a doorman who opened the carriage door in a lobby that smelled of cut flowers and something expensive Martha couldn't name. She walked through it with her bag in her hand and her spine straight, and her face arranged the way she'd learned to arrange it in Pine Hollow when someone was watching to see if she'd flinch. She did not flinch. Their rooms were on the 3rd floor, adjoining, which was the arrangement Gideon had specified and which reflected accurately the current reality of their marriage. Close enough to be present for each other, with a door between that was understood to be there. She unpacked her single case, hung the blue-green dress in the wardrobe with its tissue paper still tucked in the folds, and washed her face in the basin and looked at herself in the mirror above it. She looked tired. She was tired. 2 days of travel after 6 weeks of 6-hour evenings bent over ledgers and account books, and the compact subsections will do that. She looked tired, and she looked like herself, which was all she had to work with. She dried her face and went next door and knocked. Gideon answered quickly, which meant he hadn't been resting either. He had changed his coat, but otherwise looked the same steadiness, the same slight tension behind the eyes that he'd been carrying since they'd left the valley. "Hargrove confirmed dinner," he said. 7 o'clock. The restaurant downstairs. "Good." She sat in the chair by the window. "What do I need to know about him?" Gideon sat on the edge of the bed, which was the only other place to sit. 61 years old, started in mining, moved into timber about 15 years ago. He's practical, not sentimental. He doesn't make decisions based on people he likes. He makes them based on what makes sense. Genevieve has been working on him for 2 years. What does Genevieve offer him? Stability. A guarantee that the Ashford operation stays under experienced management. Gideon looked at his hands. She's framed herself as the responsible choice, the person who makes sure things don't go sideways. And us? Us she's framed as a risk. Martha thought about that. The narrative Genevieve had built, careful, consistent, 2 years in the making. People like stability in their abstractions even when they tolerate chaos in their personal lives, and investors more than most. Does Hargrove know about the Valley improvements? The documentation we sent? He knows. Whether he's read it closely. "We'll find out at 7, she said. Dinner with Hargrove was not what she'd imagined, which was a formal, guarded meal with careful questions and equally careful answers. Instead, Martin Hargrove turned out to be a man who ate his food while it was hot and asked what he actually wanted to know, and didn't see the point of preamble, which Martha found both surprising and immediately easier to work with. He was broad-shouldered with a white mustache and the kind of tan that came from actually being outdoors rather than from a spa. And he shook Martha's hand when he met her. Actually shook it, not the limp acknowledgement she'd been half expecting, and looked at her directly. "You sent me the lease revision," he said, before they'd even ordered. "Gideon sent it," she said. "Gideon signed it. Someone worked out the numbers." He looked at her without blinking. "The math in that revision assumes a 20-year projection on timber value. Most operations think 5 years ahead if they're being careful. Who ran the 20-year numbers?" "I did," she said. He nodded once, the nod of someone checking a box. "And the school documentation, the community investment plan." "Also me. The projects themselves are Gideon's. He'd already started them before I arrived. I identified what was working and what needed to be framed more clearly." "For the compact clause," Hargrove said. She looked at him. "Yes." He smiled, small and dry. "Genevieve told me about the clause. She told me it was a long shot and that you'd never find it, let alone understand what it meant." He picked up his fork. "She underestimated you." "Most people do," Martha said. "Not most people," Hargrove said. "Smart people. That's worse." He cut his meat. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer." "All right. What happens to Ashford Valley in 20 years if Genevieve gets what she wants in that room tomorrow night?" Martha looked at him steadily. "The operation makes money for another decade, maybe more. She's competent. I won't tell you she's not. But the community investment stops because she doesn't see value in it. And in 15 years, you start losing the best workers to operations that treat people better. The school stays 2 rooms. The medical cabin doesn't expand. The sustainable forestry that protects the operation's long-term timber supply gets compromised because the 10-year profit looks better if you cut faster." She paused. "In 20 years, the valley is smaller and the operation is weaker, and you've made good returns in the short term." Hargrove ate. Said nothing for a moment. "And if you and Gideon manage it?" "I can't promise you it's safer," she said, and felt Gideon shift slightly beside her. "I'm new to this. I make mistakes. But the 20-year lease projection is real, and the community investment is already returning value in worker retention and local goodwill, and the kind of thing that doesn't show up on a quarterly report, but absolutely shows up in a crisis." She put her fork down. "What I can promise is that we're thinking 20 years out, and that the valley's people are part of the calculation, not a cost to be managed." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment, then at Gideon, then back at Martha. "I'm not going to tell you tonight," he said. "I'll tell you tomorrow, after the reception." It was honest, and honesty was what Martha had come hoping for. So she nodded and picked her fork back up, and they finished dinner talking about something else entirely. The rail expansion and what it was doing to timber markets generally, and Martha was genuinely interested in the answer, and Hargrove noticed, and the conversation went longer than any of them had planned. Walking back upstairs after, Gideon said, "You didn't promise him what he wanted." "I know." "He wanted reassurance, an easy yes." "He wanted the truth," Martha said. "He just wasn't sure he was going to get it." She stopped at her door. "We'll see tomorrow." She slept poorly, which she'd known she would. Not catastrophically. She'd learned in hard years how to get functional sleep in difficult circumstances. But in the shallow, alert way of someone whose mind wouldn't fully let go of what was coming. She woke twice and lay in the dark doing the thing she'd always done with fear, which was to take it apart and look at its components. The room, the people in the room, the moment when Genevieve would present the documents, her own response to that moment. She had done harder things. She had sat with her father through 3 nights when the cough was so bad she'd been genuinely uncertain he'd be alive in the morning. She had stood in the feed store and heard herself described as someone no man would ever choose, and kept her face arranged and bought the flour and walked home. She had climbed into a wagon with a man she barely knew on the basis of 3 things: his eyes, his patience, and the way he'd said the debt stays paid regardless. This was a ballroom. There would be people in it who were going to look at her and make their calculations. And some of those calculations were going to be cruel. But a calculation was just a calculation. It only had power over you if you agreed to be hurt by it. She got up at 5 and dressed and wrote in the small notebook she'd brought. Not the operation notes, but the personal one, the one she'd kept since she was 12, where she worked out what she thought about things. She wrote about the dinner with Hargrove and what she'd felt when he'd asked his direct question, which was a particular kind of clarity that she only got when the stakes were real. She wrote about Gideon, which she did rarely and carefully because writing about a person made your thoughts about them more definite, and she wasn't sure she was ready for definite yet. She wrote, "He is not what I expected, and I am not what he expected, and that might be the most honest beginning anything has ever had." She closed the notebook before it got more complicated than that. By the time they went downstairs for breakfast, the hotel was already carrying the particular energy of a day that has significance. Other guests with the conference were arriving, men in good coats with the look of people who made large decisions and were comfortable with that. Women dressed with the careful precision of people who understood that how you looked in a room like this was also a kind of language. Genevieve was in the lobby. She was talking to one of the suited men Martha recognized from her valley visits, and she saw them before they reached the bottom of the stairs and watched them descend with the contained attention of someone who is trying to read something quickly before they have to respond to it. Her eyes moved over Martha. The traveling clothes, practical and good but not spectacular, and then away. "Gideon," she said when they reached the lobby floor. "I'd like a word." "Good morning, Genevieve," he said. "This afternoon, before the reception. There are details to discuss." "We're available after 2, Martha said. Genevieve looked at her. "I was speaking to Gideon." "I'm aware," Martha said pleasantly. "After 2 works for both of us." A long pause. Genevieve's expression did the thing it sometimes did, the fractional rearrangement that meant something was happening behind it. "After 2, she said, and moved away. Gideon said nothing until they were seated in the breakfast room. Then, "You know she's going to spend that meeting trying to—" "I know exactly what she's going to do," Martha said. "She's going to offer us a way out, tell us that if we agree to a formal arrangement, a limited role, a deferred authority structure, something that puts her in effective control, she'll withdraw the challenge and there won't be a scene tonight." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this since last night." "Since 3 in the morning, she said. "The answer is no." "Martha, the answer is no." She looked at him directly. "Not because I need to win, because what she's offering isn't stability, it's surrender. And the Valley doesn't need its management surrendered to someone who's never walked into the school or sat in the harvest meeting or knows Agnes Birch's name." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The recalibration expression, but deeper this time, reaching further back than she'd seen it go before. He said, "You know her name." "Agnes's?" "Yes." She frowned slightly. "Why wouldn't I?" He shook his head, not dismissing the question but setting it aside for now. "No," he said. "No what?" No to Genevieve's offer. Whatever it is, I'm with you. He picked up his coffee. I just wanted to make sure we were saying the same thing. They were. The afternoon meeting with Genevieve was in a private sitting room off the lobby, and it went almost exactly as Martha had predicted, which was not comforting because being right about something like this meant there was still the evening to get through. Genevieve laid it out cleanly, because whatever else she did not waste words. There was an arrangement available, she said, through which Gideon would retain ownership of the Valley's assets, but would operate under a partnership oversight committee, which she would chair, for a period of 5 years, at the end of which his full authority would be restored subject to committee approval. In the meantime, the inheritance challenge would be withdrawn, and they could all avoid the unpleasantness of a public proceeding. She did not mention Martha at all, which was its own statement about what the arrangement actually meant. No, Gideon said. Genevieve looked at him with the patience of someone who had expected this. Gideon, no, he said again, and that was the whole of it. Genevieve sat back and looked at them both, and Martha had the strange sense of something settling in the older woman, a last option being set aside and a plan B engaging smoothly. Then I'll see you both this evening, she said. The reception was held in the ballroom of the governor's official residence, which was a building that had been designed to make ordinary people feel the specific weight of power, high ceilings, and chandelier light, and the kind of furnishing that announced itself. Martha walked in beside Gideon and felt the room the way you felt weather. The temperature of it, the direction it was moving. The dress Frances had made was doing what she'd said it would do, which was not apologize. The blue-green was not what anyone else in the room was wearing, and Martha had understood when she chose it that being different and being wrong were not the same thing, and she kept that understanding close as the room's attention moved over her and began its calculations. There were perhaps 70 people. She identified Hargrove near the far windows, talking to a man she didn't know. She identified the 2 lawyers who traveled with Genevieve, positioned near the east doors in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental. She identified the judge, Prentice, the one Genevieve had arranged, from Gideon's description, a tall man with a trimmed gray beard who was talking to the governor's aide and carrying himself with the careful neutrality of someone who had not yet decided which way the evening was going. Genevieve was near the center of the room, elegant and composed, already engaged in conversation with Whitmore and Chen, the 2 partners she'd been working for 2 years. She didn't look at Martha and Gideon when they entered, which meant she'd seen them come in and had decided not to give them the acknowledgement. The first hour was what first hours at events like this always were. Conversation, drinks, the slow circulation of people through a room finding their positions. Several people came to speak to Gideon, business acquaintances and partners, and he introduced Martha each time without qualification or explanation, just her name and her relation to him, and then whatever came next in the conversation. A few of the wives were kind. A few were the particular kind of not kind that tried to pass as curiosity. Martha managed all of it at the same temperature, not warm enough to be performing warmth, not cool enough to confirm what people expected. A woman named Patricia Whitmore, the partner's wife, stopped Martha near the refreshments table and looked at her with the open assessment of someone who'd been told a story and was comparing it to the subject. "You're from the mountains," she said. "Yes." "I've never been. Gerald says the roads are terrible." "Some of them are," Martha said. "The valley roads are good. Gideon keeps them." Patricia Whitmore looked at her glass. "Genevieve says—" She stopped. "What does Genevieve say?" Martha asked, not combatively, genuinely. The woman looked slightly uncomfortable, which meant she had some decency in her. "That this was all very sudden." "It was," Martha agreed. "Most worthwhile things are." Patricia looked at her. Something shifted in the woman's face, a small movement toward honest appraisal. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" A pause. "I'm not sure I should say." "Someone easier to dismiss," Martha said. "It's all right. I've heard it before." Patricia Whitmore made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh and turned it into a sip of her drink. And when she walked away a few minutes later, Martha had the sense that she was not a confirmed ally, but was no longer a confirmed enemy, which was as much as could be expected in an hour. The thing happened at 9 o'clock. The room had settled into its after-dinner configuration, smaller clusters and lower voices, the governor having circulated through and settled near the fireplace with a group Martha had identified as his actual friends rather than his official company. Prentice the judge was nearby. Hargrove was still near the windows, which meant he hadn't committed to either side's gravitational pull. Genevieve moved to the center of the room. She did it naturally, the way people who are born to the center of rooms do it, without announcement, simply by positioning herself where the room's attention went. The conversation around her quieted in the organic way of people who understood something was happening. She said, loud enough to be heard across the room without shouting, "I wonder if I might have a moment of everyone's attention for a brief matter of business. Given that so many of us are here, it seems efficient." The governor looked mildly surprised but didn't object. The judge turned from his conversation. The room waited. Genevieve addressed the room rather than any individual in it, which was a choice Martha recognized as deliberate. It made the proceeding feel public and legitimate, a concern being raised for the benefit of everyone rather than an attack being launched at anyone. She laid it out with the clean precision of someone who had prepared for weeks. The family compact, the clause, the standard of material damage to company standing. She did not name Martha directly. She talked about the marriage, the circumstances, the rapidity of it, the absence of any established relationship or known character, and she let the room draw its own picture. It was, Martha had to admit, beautifully constructed. Every sentence was technically fair. The aggregate was a portrait designed to make a room full of wealthy people see a miner's daughter who had climbed into a situation she didn't belong in. She finished by saying that she had arranged for Judge Prentice to be available this evening to receive a formal petition for compact review, and that she hoped the relevant parties would understand that this was being done not out of personal feeling, but out of obligation to the enterprise's integrity. The room was very quiet. Martha looked at Gideon. He was standing straight and controlled, but she could see in his jaw the effort of that control. She put her hand on his arm, once, brief, not for the room to see, just for him to feel. And then she turned to Genevieve. "May I see the documents?" she said. Genevieve looked at her. The two lawyers moved slightly, and one of them produced a folder from a leather case. "Of course," Genevieve said. The lawyer brought the folder to Martha, which he'd clearly not expected to be doing. She opened it. She read it. She took her time. The room waited, and she could feel the weight of its waiting, the eyes moving between her and Genevieve and the documents, the calculations running. She found what she'd hoped to find on the third page. She read it twice to be certain, which she could afford because the room's attention was still on Genevieve and the judge, and she was, for the moment, being underestimated in real time. They were watching a miner's daughter read a legal document and expecting her to put it down confused or upset, and she had learned long ago that the moment before people realized they'd miscalculated was the most valuable one. She looked up. She looked at Prentice. "Judge Prentice," she said, "I'd like to address the second clause in this document before any petition is filed. The clause in Section 14, subsection C of the Ashford Family Compact." Genevieve went very still. Prentice looked at her with the alert attention of a man whose professional instincts had just engaged. "I'm listening," he said. Martha walked him through it. She did not perform. She did not raise her voice or try to be dramatic. She spoke the way she always spoke when she understood something clearly, which was directly and with enough detail that the listener could follow without feeling managed. She explained the clause, its language, and what it required, a marriage demonstrably benefiting both the operation and its surrounding communities. And then she explained what the past 6 weeks in Ashford Valley had built, the lease revision and where the additional revenue was going, the school expansion already in progress, materials ordered, a second teacher being sought, the medical cabin expansion, and the county partnership they'd initiated, the sustainable forestry documentation, the harvest meeting, and the formal support of the Valley's residents, which she'd brought as a witness letter signed by 11 people, including Agnes Birch, who'd been part of the Valley for 30 years. She laid it all out, point by point, not quickly, not slowly. The room had stopped being several conversations and had become one thing, all of it pointed at her. When she finished, Prentice was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents he'd been handed. Gideon had the copies, had had them since they'd arrived, and passed them now to the judge without drama. Prentice read them with the careful speed of a man who read documents for a living. Whitmore said from somewhere behind Martha, "That lease revision. Who ran the projections?" "Mrs. Ashford," Gideon said. A pause. 20-year projections. "Yes." Hargrove spoke from near the windows for the first time. "I saw the projections," he said. "They're sound." The room shifted at that. Hargrove's weight landing where it chose to land and landing here. Genevieve said, "A counterclause is not a dismissal of the original concern. The compact review," Prentice said, looking up from the documents, "cannot be filed if the counterclause conditions are met. That is the language of the compact." He looked at Genevieve with the careful neutrality he'd been wearing all evening, which Martha now understood had been genuine rather than purchased. "Mrs. Ashford, you are aware I reviewed the compact before this evening at the request of another party. I was not, in that review, directed to Section 14, subsection C. I'm directing myself to it now." Genevieve said nothing. "The documentation presented appears substantive, and the conditions of the counterclause appear to be met," Prentice said. "I won't be receiving a petition tonight. If you wish to file a formal challenge, Mrs. Ashford, you are welcome to do so through the proper court process, but I'll tell you candidly, my preliminary reading of the compact does not favor the challenge." The room was very quiet. Martha looked at Genevieve. The older woman was standing exactly as she'd been standing before all of it began, composed and correct, and only her eyes showed what was moving behind them. Not defeat, not exactly, but something more complicated. The thing that happened when a plan you'd built carefully met a variable you hadn't fully accounted for. Their eyes met. Martha didn't look away, and Genevieve didn't look away. And in that moment, something passed between them that wasn't warmth, but wasn't contempt either. It was closer to acknowledgement. One woman recognizing another woman who had walked into a room designed to reduce her and had declined to be reduced. The governor, who had been watching from near the fireplace with the interested expression of a man who'd seen a lot of rooms and found this one more engaging than expected, moved toward Martha. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and extended his hand. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm interested to hear more about this community development approach. Your outline on the relationship between sustainable forestry and worker community investment is something my office has been trying to put language around for 2 years. Martha shook his hand. "I'd be glad to talk about it," she said. They talked for 20 minutes. The governor's aide took notes. Whitmore drifted over after 10 minutes and listened without interrupting, which was different from how he'd been listening to Genevieve an hour earlier. Patricia Whitmore appeared at the edge of the conversation and stayed. Hargrove found Gideon near the windows, and they spoke quietly for several minutes. And when they were done, Gideon crossed the room to where Martha was still in conversation with the governor, and she saw in his face something she hadn't seen there before. Not relief, which she'd expected, but something quieter and more lasting than that. The governor said, before he was pulled away to another obligation, "Mrs. Ashford, I'd like to propose something formally in the next few weeks. An advisory role. Mountain community development is policy territory that doesn't have enough practical voices in it. Would you be open to a conversation?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I would." After he left, Gideon stood beside her and they looked at the room, which had resumed its ordinary evening shape. Clusters of conversation, the clink of glasses, the governor now holding court near the fireplace again. "Hargrove is with us," Gideon said quietly. "I heard," she said. She had not heard, but she'd watched his face when he came back across the room and didn't need the words. "You found the clause 3 weeks ago," he said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me you were building the documentation for it." "I told you I was building it. I just didn't explain the specific reason." He was quiet for a moment. "Was that you keeping information back? Like I kept things back?" She looked at him. She thought about that seriously, the way she thought about things that deserved to be thought about seriously. "No," she said. "It was me not wanting to explain a plan until I knew it would hold. There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. Then, "Martha." "Yes." "Thank you." She looked back at the room. The chandelier light, the good dresses, Genevieve near the far wall now, talking to her lawyers with the contained composure of a woman who had not gotten what she wanted and would not let the room see it. All of it exactly as difficult as she'd expected. None of it, finally, harder than she could carry. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "The governor wants a meeting. I don't know what that means." "I think it means something significant," Gideon said. "It means more work," she said, "which is fine. I'm good at work." He almost smiled. "I know," he said. They stood together in the bright, expensive room, and Martha felt the particular exhaustion of a battle that had gone the way you'd worked to make it go, which was not triumphant exactly, but was solid. The feeling of something real that had been built and had held its weight when tested. She would think about the significance of it later. Right now she was tired, and she had mud metaphorically on her boots, and tomorrow they would start the journey back to the valley, and there was still so much to do there. The school, and the timber lease, and the medical cabin, and the harvest records, and 12 letters she needed to write. She thought about writing to Tom. She thought about what she would say. She thought, "I walked into the room and I stayed standing. That's enough for one letter." Genevieve left the reception early, which Martha noted. Not dramatically. There was no visible departure, just a point at which she and her lawyers were there, and then a point at which they were not. The absence said something about the kind of person she was, which was someone who processed setbacks privately. Martha did not find this contemptible. She understood it. What she did not know, crossing the ballroom toward the door with Gideon at her side, was whether Genevieve would accept the result or whether this was simply the end of a battle within a longer war. She suspected the latter, but had learned a long time ago that you could only deal with what was in front of you, and what was in front of her tonight was a door, and on the other side of it a street, and somewhere in the dark beyond that a road that would take her back to the valley that was, she had finally let herself think, hers. Not because of a legal document, not because her name was Ashford now on paper, but because of Agnes Birch's hands on the kitchen table and 12 children in one room with a cracked chalkboard and a river that ran silver in the afternoon light, and a school that was going to have 4 rooms instead of 2. That was what she was going back to. The door opened into the cold Denver night, and Martha walked through it. The journey back from Denver took 3 days, the same as the journey in, but it felt different in the way that return trips always feel different. Not shorter exactly, but more inhabited. The landscape no longer something to be read for threats, but something already partially known. Martha slept properly the first night, which told her more about how tightly she'd been wound for the past weeks than anything she could have said about it directly. She woke in the way station inn with gray light coming through the window and lay still for a moment, taking inventory of what had happened and what it meant and what came next, which was her standard practice and one she had no intention of abandoning just because things had gone well. Things had gone well. She held that plainly without decoration. Gideon was already up when she came down, which was also standard. She'd learned early that he was a pre-dawn person, not from anxiety but from habit, the kind of person who thought best in the quiet before anyone else needed anything. He had coffee waiting, which she hadn't asked for and which she took without making anything of it. They sat across from each other in the small inn's common room, which smelled of wood smoke and last night's dinner, and she told him what she'd been thinking about on the road. "The governor's meeting," she said. "We need to be careful about what it means." Careful how? An advisory role sounds like influence. It can also be a way of being kept close enough to be managed. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I want to know what he actually wants before we commit to anything, and I want to make sure whatever we agree to doesn't pull us away from the valley more than it puts back in." Gideon looked at her. "You're already thinking about how it could go wrong." "I'm always thinking about how things could go wrong," she said. "It's how I've kept things from going wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard way to live." "It's the way I know how to live." She said it without self-pity. "You find what works, and you keep doing it." He looked at his coffee. Outside the window, the road was just becoming visible in the early light, frost on the wagon ruts, the kind of cold morning that smelled like pine and distance. "What would you want," he said, "if things were going right and you didn't have to think about how they could go wrong? Just, what would you actually want?" The question caught her in the way that honest, unexpected questions caught you, before the managed part of your mind could get to it first. She thought about it. She thought about it genuinely. The school finished properly, she said. Not just 4 rooms, good materials, a proper teacher's salary, books enough for every child. I want the medical cabin to have someone with actual training, not just a person who's good with herbs and willing. I want the northern timber rotation documented well enough that whoever manages it in 30 years has a clear record of what we did and why. She paused. And I want to go home to Pine Hollow, not to stay, to see my father. The last one surprised her slightly, coming out that clearly and that fast. Gideon nodded. We can go to Pine Hollow, he said, as soon as we're back and things are settled. He might not have much time, she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud to him, and saying it made the truth of it more solid. The doctor's letters have been good, but not certain. I know. He said it the way you said things when you didn't have anything better to offer but wanted the person to know you'd heard them. We'll go soon. She nodded and finished her coffee, and they left within the hour, the wagon moving out of the way station yard into the cold morning, and Martha watched the road ahead and thought about her father and what she would say when she saw him, and whether she'd have enough time to say all of it. The valley appeared below the mountain pass on the afternoon of the 3rd day, exactly as it had appeared the first time. Unexpectedly, all at once, the stone buildings, and the river, and the mill, and the house at the center of it. But this time Martha looked at it without the shock of the unknown. She looked at it as someone who had been down there, who knew the names of the people in those buildings, and what the North Timber lease was now worth, and where the cracked chalkboard was, and how Agnes Birch's hands looked flat on a kitchen table. It looked like something worth defending. She didn't say that, but she thought it. Hector met them at the bottom of the road because Hector always met them at the bottom of the road. And he looked at their faces and read them the way experienced people read situations and seemed satisfied with what he found there. News from the valley, he said, before they'd fully stopped. Agnes's orchard had a problem with the irrigation line on the eastern side. We fixed it. And there's a letter for you, Mrs. Ashford. Came 2 days ago. Martha took the letter before the wagon was fully stopped. It was from Callie, not Tom, which she noticed first. Callie wrote less often and more carefully, which meant when she wrote it was because she had something to say that Tom hadn't said. She read it standing beside the wagon with Hector waiting and Gideon unhitching the horse. Their father had taken a bad turn 4 days ago. The doctor had been there and had been honest with them, which Callie wrote was both terrible and better than not knowing. He was asking for Martha. He was asking every day. She folded the letter. Gideon, she said. He looked at her across the back of the horse. I have to go to Pine Hollow, she said. Tomorrow morning, early. He came around the side of the wagon. He read her face, which she was letting him read. I'll come with you, he said. She thought about saying she didn't need him to. She thought about how many years she'd said I don't need help, as a way of protecting herself from the possibility that help wouldn't come. She thought about a man who had said the debt stays paid regardless, and had meant it, and had made sure it was true before he'd had any guarantee of anything from her. All right, she said. Come. They left at first light, taking horses rather than the wagon to move faster, and made Pine Hollow in 2 days by pushing the pace. Martha had not been on horseback for an extended distance since she was younger, and her legs made their objections known by the second afternoon, but she didn't slow down and didn't complain, and Gideon matched her pace without commentary. Pine Hollow looked smaller than it had. She noticed this the way you notice things that revealed the size of the distance you'd traveled in yourself rather than in miles. The main street that had seemed like the center of everything now looked like what it was. A small mountain town's main street, functional and familiar, and no longer the entire scope of the world. Ruth Calhoun saw her from the post office doorway and waved, and the wave had something in it that was different from the careful, apologetic quality their last interaction had carried. News traveled in Pine Hollow, as in the valley. Martha didn't know what version of the Denver story had made it up the mountain road, but something had. Her father was awake when she arrived. That was the first thing Callie told her, on the step, clutching Martha's hands. Not her arms, her hands, the grip of someone who needed to anchor themselves to something real. He's been staying awake in the afternoons, Callie said. like he knew. Tom was in the doorway behind her, taller than she remembered, with the particular look of a boy who had been holding himself together for someone else's sake, and was now in the presence of someone who could take some of the weight, close to the edge of not holding. She hugged him first, long enough to mean something. He didn't cry, but it was close. She went inside. Her father was propped on his pillows in the same position she'd left him in the same bed against the same wall, but he was lighter. She could see that from the doorway. The illness had been taking its careful, patient share of him, but his eyes were the same, dark and direct and not built for lying. "There she is," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand and looked at him. "Here I am." "I heard things," he said. "Denver. A room full of fancy people." "Who told you?" "Ruth. Ruth told Emmett. Emmett told me." His hand was thinner in hers than she remembered. "She said you walked in there and turned the whole thing around." "It wasn't quite that clean," Martha said. "No, but you were standing at the end of it." "Yes." He looked at her. "Are you happy?" Was such a direct question that it moved past her prepared answers and hit something underneath. She sat with it honestly. "I'm in the right place," she said. "It's not quite the same as happy, but I think happy comes from it, eventually, from being in the right place and doing the right work." He considered that. "That's a more grown-up answer than happy." "I've had a grown-up few months." He smiled, and the smile was still his. Still the one she'd known her whole life, slightly crooked on the left side. "Tell me about it," he said. "All of it. Start from the wagon." So she did. She sat with him through the afternoon and told him about the pass and the valley appearing below it, and Gideon's real name, and Genevieve arriving in a carriage that was a statement, and the 12 children in one room, and the lease on the north slope, and the charcoal marks in the ledger, and Agnes Birch, and Hargrove by the window, and the blue-green dress, and subsection C buried in the compact like something left for someone who would know how to find it. He listened the way he'd always listened, without interrupting, with his eyes on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "This husband of yours," he said. "Yes." "Is he outside?" "He came with me. He's with Callie and Tom." "Bring him in." She went to the door and called for Gideon, who came from the main room where he'd been doing something. She would find out later he'd been helping Tom fix a hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been broken for 2 months, just because it was there and needed doing, and he had the tools. He came into the bedroom and stood near the door and looked at her father with the same directness he looked at everything. Her father looked back at him for a long moment. "Sit down," her father said. Gideon sat in the chair beside the bed. "My daughter," her father said, "has been carrying things since she was 14 years old. Things that would have broken most people. She doesn't complain about it. She doesn't look for credit. She just carries them." He held Gideon's gaze. "I need to know that you see that." "I see it," Gideon said. "Not the usefulness of it. Not the capability. The weight of it. The cost." A pause. "I see that too," Gideon said. "I'm still learning the full size of it." Her father looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded, once, the nod of someone who has asked the question they needed to ask and received an acceptable answer. Not perfect. Acceptable. Which was better than perfect because perfect wasn't available and acceptable was real. "Good," he said. He closed his eyes briefly. "I'm glad she's not alone." He passed away 11 days later, at night, with Callie holding one hand and Tom asleep in the chair by the wall. Martha had been there through the evening and had stepped out to get water and had come back to find Callie looking at her with the specific expression of someone who had just watched something end. She sat with him for a while after. She didn't cry immediately, which was not because she didn't feel it, but because she'd learned early that grief in her came in waves, and the first one took its time arriving. She held his hand and said what she needed to say without anyone to hear it, and then she got up and went to Callie and put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and they stood together in the small room in the Pine Hollow cabin and let the weight of it settle. Gideon was in the kitchen. He didn't come in unless asked, which was right. He understood when he was needed and when he wasn't, which she had come to understand was one of the rarer qualities in a person. The burial was 3 days later, in the small cemetery on the hill above the town, and more people came than Martha had expected. Not out of prominence because her father had none, but out of the ordinary human acknowledgement that a man had lived in a place and had been part of it and was now gone. Frank Alderman from the feed supply was there. Ruth and Emmett Calhoun. A dozen others. Afterwards, in the cabin, Tom asked her what happened now. He meant it practically. Where he and Callie would live, what the plan was. But under the practical question was the deeper one that 11-year-old boys asked when the structure of their world had just fundamentally shifted. "You come to the valley," Martha said. "Both of you, if you want to." Callie looked up. "What about school?" "The school in the valley has a good teacher, and we're expanding it." Martha looked at her sister. "You'd be welcome there, more than welcome. Polly needs help with the older students, and you're better at arithmetic than anyone I know." Tom said, "What's the valley like?" Gideon, who had been quiet in the corner, said, "Big. Loud in the summer when the mill runs. Good fishing in the river on the east side." He thought for a moment. "The school has 12 students, and they're about to have a lot more books." Tom looked at him with the careful assessment of an 11-year-old who had been the man of a household for several months and was now being asked to reconfigure that. "Do you need someone who's good with horses?" "Always," Gideon said. Tom looked at Martha. Something in his face settled. Not resolved, not healed, but pointed in a direction. "All right," he said. They went back to the valley in a group, which was different from how Martha had arrived. She and Gideon on horseback, Callie and Tom in the wagon with what could be brought, the cabin locked and the key left with Ruth Calhoun to manage until they could sort out the property situation properly. Martha looked back once when they were high enough on the mountain road that she could see the roof of the cabin below, small between the trees, and then she turned and faced the road ahead. The valley received them the way it received everyone who arrived, with the particular combination of welcome and wait and see that belonged to communities that had learned to be careful. But Agnes Birch came to the house the first evening and brought a jar of preserved apple from the orchard and sat with Callie at the kitchen table for an hour. And when Martha came through the kitchen, Agnes was explaining the orchard's seasonal cycle to her sister, who was listening with her full attention, and something about the sight of it, something that had been clenched in Martha's chest for weeks, loosened. The months that followed were the hardest and the best she'd known, which is how things often go when you're building something real. The school expansion proceeded, but not smoothly. The materials were delayed, and when they arrived, 2 of the window frames were the wrong size, and Polly and Martha spent a cold November afternoon in the half-finished second room trying to decide if the frames could be modified or needed to be sent back. They could be modified, it turned out, with enough stubbornness and a saw. Tom helped, which was his beginning in the valley. Not dramatic, just useful, showing up and knowing which end of a saw to hold and not complaining when his hands got cold. Callie slid into the school's upper work the way water found the right channel, naturally and without fuss. She was not Polly. They had different approaches and occasional friction, but friction between 2 competent people who care about the same thing is not a problem, it's a process, and by midwinter they had developed a working rhythm that was better than either of them alone. The governor's meeting happened in January, conducted partly by letter and partly through a 2-day visit from his aide, a young man named Prescott, who was earnest and good with details, and who spent his first day in the valley walking it with Martha and his second day in the study going through the documentation she'd assembled. The advisory role that emerged from it was specific rather than ceremonial. She would consult on territorial policy relating to resource community development, with particular focus on sustainable forestry and worker welfare standards. It was not a title. It was actual work, with actual requirements, and it would mean 2 or 3 trips a year to the capital. She told Gideon about it over the kitchen table on the evening Prescott left. "It's a lot," she said, "on top of everything here." "Can you do it?" She looked at him. "Yes, I'm asking if we can do it, because it's not just my time it affects." He was quiet for a moment, the considering quiet she'd learned to read, not as hesitation, but as actual consideration. "We can do it," he said. "Hector can manage more of the day-to-day operation coordination. He's been ready for that for 2 years. You should tell him that." "I will." A pause. Martha, you know you don't have to ask my permission. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm asking because it affects you. That's different from permission. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen more frequently in the past months, the one that was not quite the recalibration expression, but was related to it, the look of someone continuing to learn the shape of something they thought they already understood. All right, he said. Then yes, we can do it. Genevieve made one more appearance in February, and it was different from the others. She arrived without the lawyers, without the secretary and the notebook. She arrived in a carriage that was still good quality but somehow looked smaller than it had before, and she came to the kitchen door rather than the front, which Martha noticed and did not comment on. They sat in the kitchen because Martha had been working there when Genevieve arrived and didn't see a reason to move to somewhere more formal for a conversation she intended to have plainly. I want to know what you're doing with the community investment funds, Genevieve said, specifically. Martha looked at her. Why? Because I have money in this operation, and I have a right to know where it goes. You do, Martha said. Silas can give you the full accounting. I'm asking you. Martha sat back. She looked at the older woman, who was sitting with her usual perfect posture, but who had, around the eyes, the look of someone who had recently revised something they'd believed for a long time and was still adjusting to the new geography. The school expansion is 2/3 done. The medical cabin has a trained nurse as of last month. She came from a program in the capital. The sustainable forestry rotation is fully documented, and we've shared the model with 2 other valley operations in the territory, and the revenue from the lease revision. Majority goes back into the worker housing improvements. There's a housing assessment scheduled for spring. Genevieve was quiet. She looked at her hands on the kitchen table, which were perfectly gloved and showed nothing of the decades in them the way Agnes Birch's hands did. This is not how I would have done it, she said. I know, Martha said. I would have taken the lease revenue and reinvested in equipment. Equipment depreciates. People, when you treat them well, don't. Another silence. Genevieve looked out the window toward the valley. My father built this operation, she said. I have been protecting it for 30 years. I know that, Martha said, and kept her voice even but not cold. And you built something real. The relationships you have with the partners, some of that took decades. I'm not dismissing what you've done. Genevieve looked at her. But protecting something and growing it are different things. You've been protecting it for so long that you stopped seeing what it could become. Martha paused. I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a person who loved something and got frightened and started holding on too tight. The silence after that was longer than the others. Genevieve looked at the window, at her hands, at the kitchen in general, in the way of someone taking inventory of an unfamiliar room. The school, she said finally. What do the children need? Martha looked at her. Right now? A proper stove for the second room. The one we installed is adequate, but not enough for deep winter. And reference books for the older students. We have readers, but not reference. Genevieve stood. She straightened her gloves, one finger at a time, the gesture Martha had first seen in a story from Gerald at the bank on the morning everything changed. Then she said, I'll arrange the stove. Send me the list of books. She left. Martha sat in the kitchen for a moment after the sound of the carriage wheels faded, turning the conversation over in the way she turned things over that she hadn't expected. Then she got up and went back to the work she'd been doing before Genevieve arrived. She told Gideon that evening. He was quiet for a moment. You think she means it? He said. The stove, the books. I think she's a person who does what she says she'll do, Martha said. Even when she'd rather do something else. That's actually something we have in common. The stove came 3 weeks later. The books arrived in April, a full crate of them, well chosen. Whoever had selected them had done it carefully. Genevieve did not come herself. The crate had a note in her handwriting that said, only for the students of Ashford Valley School, and Martha read it twice and put it in her desk drawer. Spring came to the valley the way mountain spring always came, unevenly and with setbacks, a warm week followed by a late snow. The orchard blossoms waiting tensely, the river running fast and cold with snowmelt. The new teachers' rooms off the school building were finished in April, and on the day they were done, Martha walked down to the school, and stood in the new second room with Polly and Callie and looked at the proper stove in the corner and the reference books on the new shelf in the window that faced the eastern slope. "How many students next year?" she asked. 18 enrolled so far," Polly said. "Word's been spreading to the families farther up the slopes." "We'll need a third room eventually," Martha said. Polly and Callie looked at each other. "We were thinking the same thing," Callie said. Martha looked at the eastern window, the slope beyond it, the deep green of the timber that had been standing there for decades, because someone had decided long ago to rotate the cutting and give it time to grow. "Then let's plan it now," she said, "before we need it." Tom turned 12 that spring and had become something Martha had not fully anticipated. Not a younger version of anyone she knew, but himself, with the horses and the early rising and the particular brand of quiet competence that showed up in people who'd been through difficult things early and had come out the other side with their character shaped rather than broken. He had 3 friends in the valley and was learning to read the timber rotation maps with Hector, who had, as Gideon had predicted, taken to the expanded operational role with something close to satisfaction. On a Thursday evening in late April, Martha was on the porch when Gideon came out and stood beside her. The valley was doing what it did in the late light, the shadows moving across the slopes, the mill quiet for the evening, the river sound carrying up in the particular way it carried when the wind was right. They stood in silence for a while, which they were both comfortable with in a way they hadn't been in the beginning. "The advisory board meeting is in June," she said. "Prescott's letter confirmed it." "I know." "I'll be gone about a week." "I know that too." He leaned on the porch rail. "Agnes said the East Orchard irrigation is holding, no repeat of the winter problem." "Good." She looked at the slope. "Callie's staying," she said. "She told me last week. She doesn't want to go back to Pine Hollow. She wants to stay and teach." "And Tom?" "Tom's staying. He told Hector before he told me, which I think I should be offended by." Gideon made a sound that was clearly trying not to be a laugh. "Hector told me." He seemed pleased. "He should be. Tom's good." She was quiet for a moment. "My father would have liked to see this." "I know," Gideon said. "He would have liked the school especially. He always believed, he used to say that education was the one thing that couldn't be taken away. Even when we lost the mine and the money, he kept paying the school fee as long as he could." She stopped. "He would have liked knowing the valley children had books." Gideon said nothing, which was right. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be set into the presence of another person who would hold them. After a while, she turned and looked at him, the way she didn't often do directly. She was more comfortable with the peripheral view, the side of the eye reading of people that had served her for years. But she looked at him directly in the late light and thought about what her father had asked and what Gideon had answered, the weight of it, the cost, still learning the full size of it. "Last October," she said, "when you came to my door in Pine Hollow, in the coat with the mended elbow." He turned to look at her. "Yes. You said you'd looked for someone who couldn't be bought." She held his gaze. "Did you find what you were looking for?" He considered it the way he considered everything that mattered. Actually, with his full attention, not rushing to the reassuring answer. "I found someone considerably more complicated than what I was looking for," he said. "Which is better." "More complicated is better?" "The thing I was looking for was a concept. What I found was a person." He said it simply. Concepts don't fix things. Persons do. She looked at him for a moment. "That's almost a compliment." "It is a compliment," he said. "I'm just not very good at them." "No," she agreed. "But you're consistent. That's worth more." The valley was settling into its evening sounds around them. The last bird calls, the shift in the river's tone. Somewhere down toward the mill, a door closing. Martha put her hands on the porch rail beside his and looked out at what they were standing in the middle of, which was not a perfect thing and had never been close to one. It was a place held together by practical work and difficult decisions, and the slowly accumulating trust of people who had watched and waited and determined on their own terms that it was worth their belief. She had come here on a wagon seat next to a man in a borrowed identity, with one bag and a family in debt, and the town's laughter following her up the mountain road. She had arrived at the top of a pass with no knowledge of what was below it, and had chosen to go down anyway, and what she'd found at the bottom was not what anyone had told her she was worth. That was the thing she'd been trying to name for months, the thing underneath all the work and the lease revisions and the subsections and the Denver ballroom and Genevieve's gloves and the school's cracked chalkboard, the thing that was harder to say than all of it. The world had told her from the beginning that she was a specific category of person, that her body and her poverty and her mountain origins were a fixed set of coordinates that determined where she could go and what she could be given and what she could reasonably expect. She had heard that story so many times and from so many directions that there were days, if she was honest, when she'd half believed it. When she'd carried the debt and the work and the responsibility, not because she was strong, but because she thought strength was all she had left to offer, the only currency she could spend that no one had decided was worthless yet. And what she had found in the valley and in the work and in the people who had watched her carefully and then decided to show up was that the story had been wrong. Not because she had proven something, not because Denver had been won or Genevieve had been managed or subsection C had been found, but because the story was always wrong from the beginning, and the evidence for its wrongness had been there the whole time, in the 12 children who needed more books, and the Agnes Birches who watched and waited and then put their hands flat on the table and stayed. Worth was not a thing that got decided for you. It was a thing you built in the specific material of the days you actually had, with the people who were actually there, in the place that was actually yours. She had understood this abstractly for years. She understood it differently now. The difference between knowing something and having lived it was not small. The North Slope's second rotation section, she said, coming back to the present in the practical way she always came back to the present. Hector thinks we should start the documentation review in May. May is good, Gideon said. I'm not such. I want to do it myself, not just review his notes. Walk the section. I'll come with you. She looked at him. It's a full day's walk. I know, he said. I've been neglecting the North Slope. You've been paying more attention to it than I have. You've been running an operation. You've been running an operation and also fixing everything I missed. He said it without embarrassment. It's a fair accounting. She almost smiled. May then. We'll walk it in May. The valley held them in the gathering dusk, the slopes going blue around them, the house behind them warm with the sounds of Callie moving in the kitchen and Tom's boots on the stairs and Della's particular way of managing a stove that made the whole house smell like something worth coming home to. Martha Ashford, who had been Martha Hollowbrook, who had stood in the Pine Hollow bank and signed papers with chapped hands and held her face very still while people said what they said about her, stood on the porch of the house in the valley and listened to all of it and felt the particular kind of peace that came not from ease but from alignment, from being exactly where you had chosen to be for reasons that were entirely your own. She didn't need the world to see it. The valley knew. The people in it knew. The school that was about to need a third room knew. The North Slope timber that would be standing and healthy in 50 years because someone had walked it carefully and written everything down knew. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had just needed enough time and enough space to understand that the measuring stick the world had handed her was not the only one available, and that the one she carried inside herself, built from years of hard work and practical love and the refusal to become less than she was, that one was truer. She stayed on the porch until the last light left the eastern slope. Then she went inside where there was dinner and her family and work left to do. That was all. That was everything.